April 1945. Lower Saxony, Germany. The air in the small village of Eschershausen does not smell of spring blossoms, but of damp earth, cold sweat, and the metallic tang of distant artillery. In the dim, suffocating heat of a communal cellar, 30 women and children huddle together, their breaths shallow and synchronized in a rhythm of absolute terror. Above them, the world is ending. The heavy thud of boots on the cobblestones above isn't the familiar rhythmic march of the Wehrmacht. It is the loose, uneven stride of the conqueror. 4 years, the voice of Joseph Goebbels had crackled through their Volksempfänger radios, etching a singular, horrific image into their minds. They had been told that the Americans were not men, but a mechanized horde of gangsters and barbarians from across the sea. Men who viewed the German people as mere obstacles to be erased. The propaganda had been relentless, painting the advancing Allied forces as vengeful spirits who would show no mercy to the weak. In the minds of these mothers, every rumble of a Sherman tank engine was a death knell. They clutched their children's faces against their chests, hiding small eyes from the inevitable violence they believed was moments away. To these women, the Amos were a terrifying unknown, a force of nature fueled by the industrial might of a continent they could barely imagine. They expected the basement door to be kicked off its hinges, followed by the cold indifference of a grenade or the sharp bark of a submachine gun. They had been conditioned to believe that their racial and national identity made them targets for total annihilation. Outside, the village was a ghost of its former self. The white sheets of surrender hung limp from second-story windows, yet the women inside the cellar knew that a piece of cloth offered little protection against the wrath of an invading army. They remembered the stories of the East, of the scorched earth and the relentless vengeance of the Red Army, and they feared the Americans would bring a different, but equally final, brand of destruction. The silence between the shell blasts was the worst part, a heavy, expectant vacuum that amplified the sound of every falling brick. This was the twilight of the 1,000-year Reich, and in this subterranean darkness, the ideology of the past decade had left these women with nothing but the certainty of their own coming martyrdom. They waited for the monsters to arrive, unaware that the men currently navigating the smoke-filled streets were just as tired, just as frightened, and carrying something in their pockets that would soon challenge everything the villagers believed to be true about the nature of their enemy. Every vibration in the floorboards felt like a step toward the end of their world, a countdown in the dark where the only thing more abundant than fear was the crushing weight of their own expectations. The darkness of the cellar was a microcosm of a collapsing empire, where the only light remaining was the flickering candle of a mother's hope that her child might somehow, miraculously, be overlooked by the storm. The strategic reality of the spring of 1945 was one of a fragmented and dying Reich. While the Soviet juggernaut ground through the east, the Western Allies had breached the Rhine, turning the heart of Germany into a vast, rolling battlefield. For the civilians in these rural pockets, the grand maneuvers of Eisenhower and Montgomery were abstractions. Their reality was the sudden, violent intersection of global politics and local geography. The village of Eschershausen sat on a vital logistics route, a minor on a staff officer's map that had suddenly become a tactical necessity. This was the era of the Götterdämmerung, where the Nazi leadership demanded total sacrifice from a population that had nothing left to give. Hitler's Nero decree had ordered the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure to deny it to the enemy, effectively sentencing his own people to starvation and exposure. In this climate, the local population felt abandoned by their protectors and hunted by their liberators. The historical weight of this moment rested on a profound psychological disconnect. The German people had been promised a 1,000-year empire of prosperity, but they were reaping a harvest of ash and iron. The mothers in the cellars were living through the final gasp of a failed ideology, one that had replaced traditional morality with a cult of strength and racial superiority. Now, that strength had evaporated. They were caught in the vacuum of the end, a period where the old laws had vanished and the new ones were yet to be established. They expected the Americans to act as they had been told, as looters, as criminals, as the mongrel force described in the Völkischer Beobachter. The historical data of the time paints a picture of a nation in total psychological shock. Military records show that as U.S. Ninth Army units pushed deeper into the German interior, they encountered a civilian population that was often catatonic with fear. These people were not just witnessing a military defeat, they were witnessing the death of a worldview. The German women, having seen their husbands and sons consumed by the war machine, looked at their remaining children as the last fragments of a broken civilization. They believed the Americans would complete the work of the Allied bombers, sweeping away what little remained of their families. This expectation of cruelty was the ultimate triumph of the propaganda machine, a legacy of hate that was intended to make the German people fight to the very last child. Yet, as the sound of tank treads grew louder, the reality of the American presence was about to collide with these carefully constructed lies. The historical context of April 1945 was not just about the movement of divisions, but about the impending collision between a desperate, indoctrinated population and an army that carried the weight of a vastly different world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be measured not in miles of territory gained, but in the simple, quiet exchange of glances between the conquered and the conqueror. The street corner groaned as a massive olive-drab shape rounded the bend, the low, guttural roar of a continental engine vibrating through the very foundation of the village. It was a Sherman tank, its steel skin scarred by the journey from Normandy, followed by a file of infantrymen from the 84th Rail Splitters Division. To the German women watching through the slitted basement windows, the physical presence of the Americans was an immediate shock. These were not the skeletal, desperate figures of the retreating Wehrmacht, nor were they the wild-eyed criminals of the propaganda posters. Instead, they appeared as giants of industry. They were clad in heavy M1943 field jackets, their webbing laden with an impossible amount of gear, their movements characterized by a strange, relaxed confidence that bordered on indifference. They moved with the steady, methodical gait of men who belonged to a nation that had never known the scarcity of the blockaded Reich. The contrast was visceral. The German villagers were a people of ersatz materials, cardboard shoe soles, chicory coffee, and clothes mended 1,000 times. The Americans, by comparison, seemed to radiate a foreign vitality. Even through the dust of combat, their faces appeared well-fed, their complexions clear under the shadows of their M1 helmets. They did not look like men who were fighting for survival, but like men who were performing a massive logistical task. This was the American abundance made flesh. Every soldier seemed to possess a surplus of everything: ammunition, cigarettes, leather, and steel. To the starving German eyes, the sheer volume of their equipment was a psychological blow. It was the visual proof that the war had been lost long ago in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. As the squad reached the center of the village, they didn't rush forward with bayonets fixed or torches in hand. Instead, they took up positions with a casual, practiced efficiency. One soldier leaned against a crumbling stone wall, adjusting a heavy pack that would have crushed a malnourished teenager, and began to scan the upper windows with a calm, chewing motion of his jaw. There was no theatrical cruelty in their eyes, only the deep, hollowed-out fatigue of men who had seen too much and walked too far. They spoke in low, rhythmic tones, a language that sounded to the German ears like the humming of a distant, powerful machine. For the women watching from the shadows, this was the first crack in the facade of their indoctrination. The monsters had arrived, but they had arrived with pockets full of supplies and a demeanor that was hauntingly, bafflingly human. The terrifying other was revealed to be a weary laborer of war, bringing with him the immense weight of a world that had plenty to spare. This physical encounter began to strip away the abstractions of the state, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable reality of two different civilizations meeting amidst the ruins of one that had gambled everything on a lie. The heavy cellar door groaned on its hinges, and a sliver of harsh afternoon light cut through the stagnant air. A collective gasp died in the throats of the women as three figures appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dust and smoke of the street. The Americans did not burst in with the expected ferocity of conquerors. They entered with a cautious, almost apologetic quietness. Their M1 Garans were held across their chests, not aimed at the huddling group, but kept ready for the threats still lurking in the village eaves. The lead soldier, a sergeant with grease-stained sleeves and eyes that seemed to have seen the end of the world, paused. He did not look at the women with the predatory gaze they had been taught to fear. Instead, his eyes moved quickly over the damp walls and settled on the trembling forms of the children hidden behind their mothers' skirts. In that cramped, earthen space, the tension was a physical weight. The women watched the soldiers' hands, waiting for the moment they would reach for a weapon or a victim. But the soldiers did not move toward them. They took up positions near the small, high windows, their attention focused outward. One soldier slumped against a support beam, his breathing heavy and rattling, yet he remained a silent sentinel between the civilians and the chaos outside. There was no shouting, no harsh commands, and no laughter. The only sound was the metallic clink of their gear and the distant rhythmic thumping of mortar fire. This was the silent professionalism of men who were not interested in the spoils of war, but in the completion of a grim and necessary task. The emotional contrast was staggering. These women had spent years being told that their existence was a struggle for racial survival against a subhuman enemy. They expected the Americans to be the mirror image of the SS, calculating, cold, and fanatical. What they found instead were men who looked remarkably like their own brothers and husbands, if only their brothers and husbands had been allowed to stay human. The Americans seemed to carry an aura of profound, weary empathy. One young private, barely 20 years old, caught the eye of a terrified 5-year-old girl. He didn't sneer or threaten. He simply gave a short, tired nod before returning his gaze to the street. In that small, wordless interaction, the grand architecture of National Socialist propaganda began to crumble. The fear remained, but it was being slowly replaced by a bewildering confusion. The monsters were not acting like monsters. They were acting like soldiers who had forgotten they were supposed to be the enemy. Within the suffocating confines of the cellar, the first seeds of a transformative realization were being sown. The Americans were not there to destroy the German people, but to end the war that was already destroying them. The silence in the cellar was broken not by a scream, but by the rhythmic tearing of a waxed ration pack. One of the soldiers, his face smeared with the soot of a dozen bombed-out towns, reached into his webbing and pulled out a loaf of white bread. To the American, it was merely a standard component of a K-ration, dense, bleached, and utilitarian. To the German women watching from the shadows, it was a staggering apparition of wealth. For years, the German domestic front had been sustained on Kriegsbrot, a dark, sour loaf stretched with sawdust, potato flour, and crushed acorns. The sight of bread so white it seemed to glow in the dim light was a physical shock that transcended language. It was a symbol of a world that had not been bled dry, a civilization that possessed such a surplus of wheat and energy that it could bleach the very soul of its sustenance. The soldier did not eat it. With a slow, deliberate movement, he broke off a thick piece and held it out toward a young boy who was peering from behind a crate of rotting apples. The boy's mother instinctively tightened her grip on his shoulder, her mind racing with the warnings of poisoned gifts and treacherous kindness. But the soldier simply waited, his arms steady, his expression devoid of the triumphalism of a conqueror. The scent of the bread, sweet, yeasty, and unmistakably pure, drifted through the stagnant air of the cellar. It was the smell of a forgotten peace. Eventually, the boy's hunger overcame his indoctrination. He stepped forward, his small, trembling hand taking the bread. As he bit into it, the soft texture and the absence of grit brought tears to his eyes. This was the first taste of the American promise, an abundance so casual that it could be given away to the children of an enemy. This simple loaf of white bread became a recurring silent witness to the shift in the room's atmosphere. It represented a democracy that fed its soldiers so well they could afford to be charitable. While the Nazi state had demanded that its citizens starve for the glory of a 1,000-year future, the American soldier sat in the dust and shared his surplus. The women watched, their eyes darting between the bread and the men who carried it. They were seeing the tangible evidence of their own defeat, yet it was a defeat wrapped in the most unexpected form of mercy. The Amos were not just soldiers, they were ambassadors of a continent where the sun still shone on amber waves of grain. In the eyes of the German mothers, the white bread was more than food. It was a revelation that the world they had been told was their enemy was, in fact, the only world capable of saving them from the one they had built. The ideology of scarcity was being dismantled by a single, soft, white slice of American life. The fragile quiet of the afternoon was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic bark of an MG-42. The Hitler's buzzsaw began to tear through the air, its high cyclic rate turning the village street into a corridor of flying stone and splintered wood. From the outskirts, a desperate remnant of the Waffen-SS, refused to accept the reality of the collapse, had launched a fanatical counter-assault. These were men who had been consumed by the ideology of death, believing that if Germany could not win, it should cease to exist entirely. They moved with a frantic, suicidal energy, fire looping through the gardens and alleyways, their black uniforms caked in the dust of a burning empire. Their mortar shells began to walk down the main street, the explosions tossing cobblestones like pebbles. Inside the cellar, the world became a nightmare of vibration and noise. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the building above groaned under the impact of small arms fire. The American soldiers, who moments before had been sharing their rations, transformed instantly. The casual fatigue vanished, replaced by a cold, kinetic precision. The sergeant barked a single sharp command over the din, and the squad moved to the openings, their garrons barking back with a steady, semi-automatic resolve. They did not retreat deeper into the cellar for cover. They leaned into the danger, their bodies forming a barrier between the metal storm outside and the families huddled in the dark. For the German women, this was the ultimate moment of cognitive dissonance. Their own countrymen, the defenders of the fatherland, were the ones raining fire down upon their homes, indifferent to the lives of the civilians trapped within. The SS soldiers saw the village only as a tactical position to be held or destroyed, viewing the women and children as mere collateral in a doomed struggle for honor. In stark contrast, the Americans, the supposed barbarians, were standing their ground to repel the attack. The sound of the American M1s, rhythmic and purposeful, became a new kind of shield. The women watched as the soldiers braved the flying glass and masonry, their eyes fixed on the source of the fire, refusing to yield the threshold. It was a chaotic, terrifying realization. The enemy was protecting them from their own. The violence of the SS was the final, ugly expression of a regime that valued a nihilistic end over the preservation of its people, while the American response was the first act of a new world that placed the value of life above the glory of the state. The cellar, once a tomb of fear, had become a fortress held by strangers against the very men the villagers had once hailed as heroes. The battle for the village square reached a fever pitch as a German stick grenade detonated against the upper masonry, showering the street in jagged stone. In the chaos, the unthinkable occurred. The cellar's rear exit, weakened by the vibrations, buckled outward. 3 children, panicked by the sudden roar of the collapse and the choking dust, bolted into the open air of the rear courtyard, directly into the line of fire. The German women shrieked, a sound of pure, helpless agony that rose above the rattle of gunfire, as they watched their young ones stumble into a kill zone swept by the frantic crossfire of the SS remnants. To the fanatical German units in the Treline, these children were merely moving shapes in a tactical sector, obstructions to be cleared in their desperate bid to stall the American advance. The response from the Americans was instantaneous and devoid of hesitation. The sergeant, who had been directing fire from the cellar window, didn't stop to calculate the risk. He vaulted through the jagged opening, his heavy boots hitting the rubble with a sickening thud, followed closely by 2 of his men. They did not take cover. Instead, they used their own bodies as human shields, sprinting into the open to intercept the children. The sergeant threw himself over the smallest boy, pinning him to the earth as bullets kicked up puffs of dust mere inches from his own head. The other 2 soldiers moved with a coordinated, athletic desperation, scooping up the girls and sprinting toward the lee of a disabled half-track. The German women watched through the ruins, their breath caught in their throats. They saw the monsters of Goebbels' nightmares deliberately exposing themselves to lethal fire to protect German blood. The Americans were not just fighting. They were performing an act of sacrificial guardianship that defied every tenet of the National Socialist worldview. The heavy, olive-drab fabric of their jackets became a temporary sanctuary for the terrified children. In those few harrowing seconds, the soldiers' actions provided a shield of flesh and steel that the Reich had long since abandoned. The sheer audacity of the rescue, American men risking everything for the offspring of their enemy, was a cinematic rupture in the narrative of the war. It was the moment the ideology of death was defeated by the simple, stubborn American instinct to protect the innocent. As the soldiers crawled back toward the safety of the stone walls, shielding the children beneath them, the transformation of the village's spirit was finalized. The children were safe, not because of the protectors they had been born to serve, but because of the strangers they had been taught to hate. As the dust of the skirmish began to settle, a heavy, ringing silence descended upon the courtyard of Eschenhausen. The SS units had melted away into the surrounding woods, leaving behind only the spent casings of their fanaticism. In the center of the yard, the American sergeant slowly stood up, brushing the pulverized brick from his knees before handing the trembling German boy back to his mother. The woman did not pull away. Instead, she collapsed toward the soldier, her hands clutching the rough, olive-drab wool of his sleeves in a gesture that was half prayer and half apology. The other women emerged from the cellar, moving like ghosts through the settling haze, their eyes fixed on the soldiers who were already beginning to check their weapons and redistribute their remaining white bread. The transformation was absolute and irreversible. In the span of a single hour, the psychological foundation of 12 years of National Socialism had been hollowed out. These women had witnessed a truth that no radio broadcast could ever erase. Their own brothers in the black uniforms had treated their lives as expendable, while the subhuman enemy had treated their children as sacred. The historical evidence of this shift is found in the sudden, widespread cooperation that often followed American occupation in these sectors. The women began to bring out what little water they had, not out of fear, but as a reciprocal act of humanity. They looked at the Americans not as conquerors, but as a strange, wealthy, and unexpectedly moral force that had broken the spell of their own nightmare. This was the death of the master race myth, not through superior violence alone, but through superior character. The German women realized that the strength of the Americans didn't just come from the steel of their tanks or the endless crates of their supplies, but from an ideology that permitted a soldier to value the life of a foreign child over his own safety. The symbols of the Reich, the iron crosses and the jagged runes, now seemed hollow and brittle compared to the soft white bread and the steady, protective hands of the GIs. As the mothers pulled their children close, they weren't shielding them from the Americans anymore. They were shielding them from the memory of the world they had just left behind. The perception of the United States shifted from a mechanized threat to a beacon of a terrifyingly generous liberty. For the first time in a decade, these women felt the weight of the state lift from their shoulders, replaced by the simple, confusing, and beautiful reality of being treated as human beings by those who had every reason to be their executioners. The soldiers of the 84th Division sat among the ruins, their presence a living rebuttal to the philosophy of total war. To the German women, The sight of these men cleaning their rifles and sharing their chocolate rations was a profound lesson in the ideology of abundance versus the ideology of death. For over a decade, the National Socialist state had operated on the principle of social Darwinism, that the world was a brutal arena where only the strong survived by crushing the weak. This belief system had justified the starvation of occupied territories and the eventual abandonment of their own civilians. The Germans had been told that democracy was a weak, decadent system that produced soft men incapable of true struggle. Yet, the men before them were anything but weak. They had crossed an ocean, breached the Atlantic Wall, and dismantled the most formidable military machine in history, all while maintaining a moral compass that allowed them to risk their lives for the children of their enemies. This was the great American paradox that stunned the survivors of Escherichausen. The soldiers represented a system that did not need to hoard every scrap of bread or every drop of fuel to prove its greatness. Their strength was rooted in a surplus of both material goods and human empathy. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the rubble, the contrast between the two worlds became even more stark. The Nazi regime had been built on the glorification of death, urging its youth to die for a flag that offered no future. The Americans, however, fought with the goal of returning to a life of peace and plenty. Every action they took, from the casual way they shared their sweets to the ferocious way they guarded the cellar, was an extension of a society that valued the individual over the collective will of a dictator. The women realized that the American abundance was not just about the white bread or the endless convoys of trucks, it was an abundance of spirit. They saw that a soldier who is well-fed, well-equipped, and raised in a culture of liberty carries a different kind of power into battle. He does not need to be a monster to be a victor. The tactical success of the American squad was intertwined with their humanity, proving that a free society could produce warriors who were more effective than the indoctrinated fanatics of the SS. For the villagers, this was a moment of intellectual liberation. They were beginning to understand that the defeat of the Reich was not a tragedy for the German people, but a rescue. The ideology that had demanded their children's lives was being replaced by one that offered them chocolate and safety. In the quiet reflection of that evening, the women of the village finally saw the American flag not as the banner of an invader, but as the herald of a world where life, once again, had intrinsic value. By the following morning, the village of Escherichausen was no longer a battlefield, but a quiet island of transition in the vast, turbulent sea of a collapsing empire. The American squad had moved on, their heavy vehicles leaving deep, muddy ruts in the cobblestones that would eventually harden and remain for years as a physical memory of their passage. The women and children emerged from the damp shadows of their cellars, blinking in the unaccustomed brightness of a spring sun that felt remarkably indifferent to the fall of nations. They looked at their village with new eyes, seeing not just the ruin of their homes, but the debris of an exhausted ideology. The scattered wrappers of Hershey bars and the empty tins of American rations lay among the discarded gas masks and rusted helmets of the Wehrmacht, a silent testament to the collision of two vastly different worlds. The story of the encounter in the cellar became a whispered legend, a foundation stone for the reconstruction of the local identity. The mothers did not tell their children stories of the Amos as monsters, but of the men who stood in the fire to save them. This shift was a microscopic version of the grander historical pivot taking place across the continent. The realization that the Americans possessed a power that was both industrial and deeply moral provided the psychological framework for the coming decades of peace. The German people had been forced to confront the ultimate failure of their own leadership, which had offered them only glorious death, and contrast it with an enemy that offered them a second chance at life. The white bread, once a symbol of impossible wealth, became a symbol of the democratic promise, that a society built on the value of the individual could create a world of enough, rather than a world of never-ending struggle. In the final accounting of the war, the victory in the village of Escherichausen was not measured by the number of enemies killed or the strategic ground held. It was measured in the survival of a few children and the total collapse of a hateful lie. The American soldiers had brought with them something more potent than their artillery, a glimpse of a future where abundance was used to shield the weak rather than to dominate them. This moment of grace amidst the ash of 1945 remains a poetic reflection on the enduring truth of human freedom. It proves that even when the darkness of ideology is at its most absolute, the simple, quiet light of human decency can still illuminate the path toward a new beginning. The war ended not just with the signing of documents in a schoolhouse in Reims, but in the hearts of the mothers who realized that their children were safe in the hands of the men they had been told to fear. The ruins eventually sprouted new life, but the memory of the white bread and the soldiers' protective embrace remained, a permanent reminder that the greatest strength of a free people is their refusal to become the monsters they fight.